Thank you all for joining us this evening. Again, this series has been quite powerful, and we're very, very privileged to have another panel of very distinguished and experienced individuals who have been engaged in the conversation, engaged in the work associated with NAGPRA, or not. And so this evening, the title of this is called Consumption in the Marketplace, and we highlight the Paris auction. Some of you may have heard of the controversy surrounding this particular events, and it isn't anything that's new, really. I mean, there has been an ongoing activity that really has created a whole new set of issues for tribes in their dealings with repatriation and protection of cultural patrimony. So this evening, I want to introduce our panelists. If we had more time, I would allow them to introduce themselves, but we want to get into the core of the conversation tonight. And so I will provide the introductions. And we have former governor of the Pueblo of Okeawinge and current tribal councilman, Mr. Anthony Moquino.
Good evening.
We also have Mr. Leigh Kuwanwisiwma, who has traveled all the way from the Hopi tribe. He is the director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, and he just informed me that he's been at this for 26 years, serving his tribe in Arizona. To his left, we have Mr. Richard Begay, who is representing the Navajo Nation. Mr. Begay worked with the Navajo Historic Preservation Department for many years on a number of issues, including NAGPRA. The Navajo Nation played a key role in several issues as this particular policy was being implemented. They've always been very much involved in and concerned about the way in which this particular policy plays out in relation to patrimony and human remains associated with the Navajo people. To his left, we are also honored to have Mr. Jim Enote from the Pueblo of Zuni. Mr. Enote is the executive director of the Kuwanwisiwma Museum at the Pueblo of Zuni. He is also the executive director of the Colorado Plateau Foundation. So, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. So, to set the stage for this discussion tonight, I want to ask two of our panelists to provide an introduction to this issue of the Paris auctions and to discuss a little bit about their involvement once really it was a result of the media that really stirred a response from not only tribes, but others who work in this field. So at this time, I would like to ask Leigh, if you would, to provide us with that. And we'll follow with Jim.
Sure, I'll make my preliminary introductions brief, pretty much outline the issue, and then I hope we can have time to elaborate on what happened. The tribe got notice back in March of 2013 that for the first time we heard there was an auction in Paris. What, of course, was urgent at that time, once we got notice, was now looking at the catalog and seeing that 65 of our katsina friends were going to be auctioned off. And I believe we got notice probably at least three to 3.5 weeks prior to the auction. So that was the start of now this history of Paris collections, and also we'll elaborate on our lawsuits in French court. But the tribe did file a lawsuit in French court thanks to one French attorney who helped us, or actually helped me directly, because I just could not mobilize our political decisions in the time frame we were looking at. So I took it upon myself, and I did find a French attorney who represented the Hopi tribe. So we lost that lawsuit, and subsequently the tribe faced some more auctions over there. The tribe filed ultimately 4 lawsuits, all similar arguments and all similar decisions by the French court. So over this past year, the Hopi Tribal Council decided not to pursue any more further legal action, but rather the 4 lawsuits that we filed have now been consolidated, and we are appealing the lower court's decision at this point. So that's the legal part of it. And since then, since April of 2013, there's been subsequently several more lawsuits, several more auctions, probably totaling now probably about 8, including one just this past January again. And of course, other activities took place later, including literally just trying to be as aggressive as we possibly can, as possible as we could. And we finally got all of our congressional representatives on board, both from the Senate and the House side, and they represented the Hopi tribe's interests and made a very strong demand to the State Department, the Justice Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation to take immediate actions to halt these auctions. So that's the backdrop of what we faced back then. And the thing that I guess is in mind all the time is that in April of 2013, the auction actually happened on my birthday, April 12th. and you know, of course, we lost 65 katsina friends, and that, so that's kind of the bitterness of that situation.
Sure. Thank you. At the Kuwanwisiwma Museum, where I direct, it's a small nonprofit museum. It's actually unusual because it is a standalone museum on the Zuni reservation, so we don't receive funding from the tribe. And however, we are very well connected in the field of museology, and when we heard about the auctions, it actually came through as an email from a friend. Have you heard of this? We looked online, and there it was. And the first thing that struck me was we know that there's always been auctions going on. Since the early 1900s, there's been things auctioned off, sacred items, around the world. Hong Kong, New York, Oslo, Berlin, everywhere. Paris, of course. But what's happening now with new digital media, this information travels much more quickly and it's much more accessible. So we were able to see, yes, there it is. We didn't have to write a letter to an auction house requesting a catalog. It was just there online. So we took a look and we saw what was there, and there were things identified as Zuni. We took a very good look at those, as best as we could from the images on the online catalog. And we thought very hard about it. There was many reactions, of course. Disgust, for one, confusion, what can we do? And as Leigh was saying, we immediately thought, well, what kind of legal instruments can we bring forward to help stop something like this? And as we did more and more research, and Leigh has done tons of research too, it's really coming up against several walls. And but it's our MO, isn't it? We're always coming up against walls as Native peoples, and we're always finding a way around them and making new doors and windows. So we knew that there was work, for example, through UN declarations of cultural property. There's NAGPRA. People asked about what about the Declaration of Indigenous Rights and so on, but those really didn't have the force of law in France. And when you're dealing with commerce, especially in the trade of things like this, it operates in the near laissez-faire market. And so to try to say that there should be restrictions on this kind of commerce is very difficult to tell another country how they should do their business. And so when we approached people like State Department, they said, yeah, we can write letters and say lots of things, but it's not going to have much effect. So from there, I mean, I don't know, Brian, if you want me to bring up the issue of replicas yet, but that was just our background, how we were introduced to it was online.
Okay.
Save it for later.
Yes, if you don't mind. But what I would ask Leigh to maybe add is the inclusion of other tribes, because it was, again, a very immediate almost response. What was that engagement like, and how is that playing out at this point?
I think initially when we examined the catalog, of course, we flipped through the pages and found out that there were other tribal items nationwide. And so locally, I know in starting now today's network of tribal coalition, I forwarded the catalogs to the affected, particularly the Pueblos, particularly Acoma and Jemez, because Jemez, I knew from my friends that they were looking for some items for a long, long time, and I saw images of it before, and then when I looked at the catalog, there they were. So that was the start of, again, at least some communications at the tribal level. And of course, today it's grown. We have the Navajo Nation pretty much paying attention to the auctions. Between Hopi and Acoma, we met with them one-to-one because it goes on, as Jim said, you know, and we finally, I believe, got a law enforcement assistance thanks to the help of the Laguna and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Special Agent. But it's going to take a lot of effort because there's higher priorities that we have to take a look at. As Jim said, we can probably put political pressure, but that's not going to do much. Laws have to be changed. For example, NAGPRA, the repatriation law, does not deal with international trafficking. And the first offense, if you're convicted, is a misdemeanor. And all of that is part of now the challenge facing the tribe. So I hope the coalition can grow. Again, out of these forums, we hope we can extend our invitation to other tribes to join us.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that. So one of the other dilemmas in this whole scenario is, you know, you have, yes, the exchange of authentic patrimony items that leave the country through whatever means. And over time, probably the last 100 years, we have seen the creation of replicas, fakes if you want to call them that, that get sold in the same market. So my question to all of you is, how are you addressing this issue? And what is fueling this? What fueled it in the initial years? If it's still happening now, what are some of those things that are, you know, forcing maybe or encouraging tribal members and non-tribal members to create these objects and sell them? What's feeding this activity? Jim?
Yeah, I'll start off here. In the late 1800s and early 1900s at Zuni, there were many collectors that were coming to gather things. They were dispatched from Smithsonian, Bureau of Ethnography, and others, But the thinking was that we would be extinct soon because of globalization and other things. So collectors were coming, looking for, some things were day-to-day items, some things were ceremonial or ritual items. And when they arrived, obviously when they preferred to speak with someone who could speak English. And oftentimes those were traders. And the traders got the word that these people wanted ceremonial ritual items. Some of these traders said, well, I can get you something by this afternoon. And so began also, as at least at Zuni that we know of, was an underground market of creating replicas. And some of those have found their way even into the collection here at the Indian Arts Research Center. Our work at the Ashbelwan Museum, we have reviewed collections at over 34 museums, about 35 museums, tens of thousands of Zuni items. And some of them were collected to be ritual or ceremonial objects. And I can guarantee you, I can tell you, many of them are replicas. Many of them are fakes. Many. A substantial number. So when the Paris auctions came about, I felt strongly that, thank goodness, the lawyers are doing their noble work. And we'll help and enable them as best we can. The media is doing their part to bring the attention to this bad business. And scholars are writing about the asymmetry of powers and possession. And I felt that while that is going on, while these people are doing good work, I wanted to bring into this discussion, this cloud of doubt, that buyer beware, that if you are holding something that you think is a ritual or ceremonial object, it may not be. I mean, there are fakes circulating, whether it's Egyptian art, whether it's Roman, all kinds of things, Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian things. There's a lot of fakes out there in the market. And the only people that can authenticate them are people from the source, the people who make and use them. Not somebody that the auction house hires. They just look to references and compare the image with some writings or another image and say, yeah, that looks like the same thing. It's people from the source that can authenticate them. And my feeling was that we are not going to authenticate them. Just let this cloud of doubt be out there. Buyer beware. Meanwhile, the other work is going on.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Begay?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in Santa Fe. I don't get up here very often, but it's very nice, and they put me up at the La Posada, which is extra nice. I have to make a disclaimer here. Brian introduced me as working with the Navajo Nation. Although I am Navajo, I am not a representative of the Navajo government. So anything I say is my personal opinion. I worked with the Navajo Nation for quite some time, starting in the late 80s, working with the Historic Preservation Department. When I started there, NAGPRA had just come out, and I worked with a number of people in the Historic Preservation Department to build what we call the Traditional Cultural Program to address issues, not only repatriation issues, NAGPRA issues, but also dealing with federal agencies and consultation and so on. One of the first things that we got a call from was here in Santa Fe, actually, from a gallery who they wanted us to come pick up a Navajo jish. And so we drove up here, and lo and behold, it was a reproduction of a Navajo jish made by a Navajo for sale. So this is something that we have come across since. There's, of course, I think there's probably more Navajo ceremonial items out there than the three other tribes represented here on the panel. I mean, you can find them everywhere. The international market certainly is a new venue for a lot of this now. But, it's not just the ceremonial items that are being reproduced. I mean, we see, just walking around today on the plaza, reproductions, and Navajos are doing these, of course. Now, sand paintings, you see those everywhere. Those are ceremonial reproductions of commercial reproductions of sacred ceremonial sand paintings. Navajo weavings, there's weavings that mimic Navajo weavings from north of Mexico. We have even Navajo fake medicine people out there. There are probably other tribal people who pass themselves off as tribal people, as authentic Navajo, authentic medicine people as well. So it isn't just the GISH. I mean, we're fighting a whole gamut of fakeness, of appropriation, and so on. And it just reminded me that I saw something else today, a Navajo-looking basket that came from Africa. You see those a lot. So we're dealing with a lot of this, and the Navajo government has not addressed these issues, of course, and I speak from a community person who's very involved in the traditional community, and for a lot of traditional peoples, they would like, I mean, obviously they would like to see a stop to this, stop making these commercial sand paintings, stop making, people who still weave get really angry when they see Mexican style or Navajo style Mexican rugs and stuff up there. And, the medicine people get very upset when they see these fake Navajo jish and so on, everything from prayer sticks. And the bottom line is money. I mean, and I don't need to mention the fact that there are lots of Navajos out there making, Hopi-style katsinas or, other Pueblo-style sacred art. And it really boils down to money. I mean, I think that people out there who live in a situation where there's no economic development in their communities, who have access to capital or credit or whatever, I mean, they're desperate. They want to feed their families. And unfortunately, I mean, that's, I think, the bottom line. How do we put a stop to that? If that little bit of income that they get from that, and it feeds some family out there, who am I, the traditionalists out there saying, who are we to put a stop to this, so that, because it is feeding a family out there. And it is a really big, tough decision. I mean, I realize there's, Navajos have always been accused, I'm going to put that right on the table, have been accused of cultural appropriation. I mean, I'm sure these gentlemen here sitting next to me will be the first to say that. But it is something that, it does come down to money. And I'm not here to defend it, but it is a reality that a lot of these feeds a family.
Thank you. Leigh?
Yeah, very quickly, I think Jim is right. The turn of the century seems to be really the era that resulted in huge numbers of artifacts going off reservations. Back in the 1880s, we had 4 collection expeditions out on Hopi at the same time. And I studied that. I studied that history. And it's just amazing what we were able to discover. Over in Third Mesa, the fellow by the name of Henry Voth, he was a missionary and then later a trained linguist, and he was able to talk, we understand, pretty fluent Hopi. And he worked and was hired for the Field Museum in Chicago. And so he was out there at the turn of the century trying to buy stuff. And of course, the Hopis didn't want to part. My grandfather lived through that era, and he remembers bits and pieces of that activity. And one of the interesting things that we found out in Voth's notes, but also in another anthropologist or collector who was doing the same thing up in Zuni, Cushing, was that there was one period of time when Voth was doing that in the 1890, towards the end of that decade, collecting, when it was the Hopis were hit with a pretty serious drought and subsequently famine. And of course, the Hopis weren't wanting to part with their sacred objects. So Voth was knocking on wood, apparently, and not being very successful. Well, Cushing came around and witnessed that. So what the records show was that he went back to Gallup, to Santa Fe, and purchased 7 wagon loads of commodities, food, blankets, and he went back to Oloraibi. And that's how he was able to apparently get some of the major artifacts, because he was not offering money, he was offering food to starving families. So if you were the head of household And Cushing said, I want that altar, and I'll give you 4 sacks of flour. What would you do when you had your kids starving? So that's part of the written record, and how things develop over time. So the story is he came to Hopi with 7 wagon loads of commodities. He went away with 7 wagon loads of artifacts. Vallo later, of course, collected, and he took his stuff up to Chicago, and with the Katsina friends, the museum said, oh, you collected too many. We're just going to pay you for 40, and you can keep the rest of it. So Vallo just took it as personal property. So some of that collection that he did back at that time, as far as trying to trace it, I know out of Vallo's collection of Katsina friends, there's a dozen down at the National Museum in Mexico. And there's several more out of the Vallo collection that is at one of the Japanese museums. So he pretty much just sold it. And that's how a lot of this stuff ended up in private collections. See, so yeah, so that's a story that I just have vivid in my my memory of as to how callous the collecting was at that time.
Thank you. Mr. Moquino.
Sangitamo, good evening again. I hope you're all doing well. I can see my Galisteo friends out there, Galisteo Benson friends. I'll take another perspective on this. I've been a NAGPRA representative of Kuwanwisiwma for 17 years. And this information that is coming up, I was present when Leigh made his emotional presentation to the Southwest NAGPRA reps about what was happening internationally. And since I was talking to Bruce and then now Mr. Vallo, I looked at it from a different perspective. Number one, we in my experience now, with the advent of the construction of the Abiquiu Dam, they disrupted many Aboriginal sites. And what happened is that as people went through, they took the liberty of taking sacred images. And now we're getting back to, because of NAGPRA law, they're contacting us to say, I found this human remains in this section. I found this human remains. And those are all part of the Table Basin, as our anthropologists have noted. And so that's one issue. So what I wanted to do to make a more holistic approach with some technical background is I wanted to marry the National Historic Preservation Act, which was in 1966, which gives a lot of alternatives. And you gotta, I don't think we're organized as Native Americans. I think some of the people on the dais had said, we're basically doing a lot of it on our own. We're lucky that there's friends in France to help the Hopi. But that's an interesting law that has alternatives. That if you can use the language, you can perform some aspects of protecting your sacred objects and your ancestral heritage. The other one's, again, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. And the one that I will focus on now, since we're on this subject and time, is the Indian Arts and Craft law of 1990. And since this became the topic of this session, I looked at it, and in November of 15, this law was implemented, and it's to the United States Fish and Wildlife. They partnered with with the federal team and the United States Attorney's Office. And I'll just read that two galleries in the Old Town, Gallery 8 and Gallery Azul, which were manned by Neil Ali, Mohammed Abed, and Christian Bowen. And what they were arrested and charged with was fraudulently selling Filipino-made jewelry as Native American-made. So as they were talking about, they found out some of this incidents through the network system. And I just went through this just to prepare myself for this. And there is these networks out there. And it's people like you who are, which we count on, just like the Galisteo Basin. We have a myriad of experts. There's Beth over there. There's Rebecca over there. There's Cheryl over there. They're all very expert. And what they do is they coalesce the need for informing and teaching us to look for these events, and they help prepare the tribes like Okeawinge, which doesn't have significance of artists, organizations like Zuni and Hopi, but we need to prepare ourselves. A lot of these issues are you're on your own issues. Unless you have friends and you know, I'm not a nerd. I don't have the systems down. I was just showing him my address book. It's pretty old and frail right now, but we count on you. We count on each other, and so that we need all of us to maintain the integrity of us Aboriginal people, and you as all of us as American.
Thank you. So we have these objects that are replicas, maybe fakes, that make their way into, in some cases, some of the auction houses. In some cases, they're parts of collections that are maybe in the process of being repatriated. I'm wondering what challenges then are presented to the tribes, and how do the tribes handle this issue of, adhering to the NAGPRA process, fulfilling the process and the requirements of cultural affinity and that burden of proof that's come up in previous conversations. I'm wondering then, what are some of those, what hinders the process as a result of the inclusion of fakes or replicas that are part of these collections?
They go, it's fresh in my mind. When you get older, if you don't say it now, you'll forget about it. But similar to what he's indicating, the villains aren't just the people that I learned in New Mexico Site Watch. We had in 1960, the University of New Mexico did a excavation of the first capitol in Okeawinge, and we are now being held hostage by the Maxwell Museum. They have all our sacred information and objects, but also Spanish objects. So it's not just that. And the fakery that we're looking at, we are now following what Hopi has done on the La Junta Boy Scouts. And we just prepared, the Tribal Council just approved a letter stating the same thing, that this is so disrespectful that I couldn't go into your church or wherever and replicate what you guys are doing to the public. So the fakery happens at different levels. We know that this is a bona fide Boy Scout system, but the powers that be must have some latitude of saying where does this reality go, and when does it turn fake? Because when we do a dance, it doesn't happen in one afternoon. It is maybe a month to prepare from different societies to do it. Thank you, I'm sorry.
That's okay, thank you.
One of the earliest cases I got involved with at Navajo was a set of nightwave masks, were commonly called the Abiche mask, and they were on display at the Field Museum in Chicago. They were on display for many years, and every once in a while, a Navajo person would see that collection and would call the Navajo offices and say, "What are you guys doing about this? Why don't we take them down?" And through long conversations with the Field Museum, it turned out they made the case that these were specifically made for sale to the market. But they were fairly old, and although they were made for the market, many of the traditional people that we talked to wanted those masks off of display, and they wanted us to try to do what we can to repatriate those masks, even though they were made specifically for the market. We went round and round with the board of directors, or whatever you call them, with the Field Museum. At the end, they actually kept them, mostly because of the treatments that they have gotten over the years. Like arsenic, they were treated with arsenics to keep them from getting for the infestations and so on. So I bring that up because although they've made the argument that was commercially made, they were made for commercial sale, that they were authentic enough that the tribal elders wanted them off the display. So there are those kinds of incidences that we've come across in the past where we've seen that there may be fake items, but they have enough authenticity to them that we need to be careful with them. One of the things that I think NAGPRA really does, and I think this is probably an issue that has come up in previous discussions, is that NAGPRA itself deals with the legal issues, the issues of property and so on, but it does not deal with the spiritual and cultural issues that we have to deal with as Indian people. And that's the really biggest challenge that we have. How do we how can we make people in Paris understand there's a lot more involved to this than just the physical objects, and that's really important. And when you see these masks at the Field Museum, that's what people are feeling, is that they've got a feeling that these are the same deities that they see dancing at their ceremonies. These are the same deities that they make their offerings to. And if it's that close to in the replication, that close to the real thing, then they should not be on display. And we get into issues of who has the right to just see those. Because we do have these traditional restrictions on who should see those kinds of masks.
Jim, you want to add anything?
Just maybe briefly, just short, that whether the items are consecrated or not, as the real ones should be, the fact is that they're seen as obscene, sacrilegious. It's a really sad thing to see for many people that even some of us shouldn't see them, and there they are, replicas or not. It's a very troubling thing for us, and we're very conflicted about it, and we're pressured now to come up with answers, and it's not something we can come up with answers very quickly. It's very complex, and as Leigh was saying earlier, we're also having to deal with our tribal. We have different governance systems. We have our overarching theocratic system and our elected representatives. And when there's change over elected representatives, sometimes things fall through the cracks and people drop the ball and so on. It's not something we can rush through, but we are very conflicted, and it is very troubling.
Leigh, would you like to?
I think there was a classic example that occurred back in the late 90s, the first time that I actually got involved with fake katsina dolls coming in from the Philippines. And interestingly, it was the customs office in Tucson that gave us a call, and just through random inspections, they ran into this big cart full of what was labeled Hopi katsina dolls. And they called me, and of course, we knew they were fake. because they were being imported in from the Philippines. So at our level, immediately we did ask the customs to confiscate it. And so they did, and we went down and inspected these items. And I tell you, I mean, you really couldn't tell those from original katsina dolls that Hopis made. And of course, there's so much publication out there, and of course, we've appropriated our ceremonial items ourselves as well, as Richard is saying. So we did end up confiscating those items. And we did take a look at the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which of course deals or tries to deal with fake items. So that's one thing that we used at that point because they were labeled Hopi katsina dolls, but they weren't manufactured by Hopis. All right. Well, about 6 months later, we got another call from the customs office. And you know what happened? Same thing. Katsina dolls, but it was also labeled made. They weren't labeled this time Hopi katsina, they were labeled made in Hopi. What happened over in the Philippines was that this little hamlet where these dolls were being made quickly changed their name to Hopi. So the tags actually said made in Hopi. See, that's a classic example. The other one that I think Jim alluded to is that back in the early 90s, we took a visit to the Field Museum. And some Hopis have always complained about a series, as a matter of fact, almost a dozen of our ritual, very esoteric altars on display up there for a long time. So that was one of the initial trips we made up to Chicago with about 15 of our religious leaders. And we were all shocked. This was the first time that we saw them in person, and they were in these huge showcases of almost all of the ceremonies that we had that had altars. And particularly some of the older gentlemen who were initiated into these ritual societies were just shocked that these were on display. And so we eventually did take them off, but what happened was that they were, in fact, replicas. And we went over to Bethel College to Newton, Kansas, to the Mennonite Library, and we actually got a hold of this gentleman I talked about earlier, Voth. He was the one who eventually sold those replicas to Chicago, but the records also showed that when it came to the actual manufacture of these altars, he actually paid Hopis to replicate, manufacture these things. And that's why they were just, many of them said these are authentic. I mean, I belong to this one society. I look at the one in Arkiva, and I look at the one up in Chicago, one and the same, because they were manufactured by Hopis. And that's how Vallo ended up with a lot of Third Mesa Oraibi altars that eventually ended up over at Chicago. And those are examples of parts of how replications are done, in the past, including those coming in from the Philippines.
I just want to add, my father became a quasi-famous person, and my mother, when my father passed, sold some of his original art, And this individual, and this is another version of what we're talking about here, but this individual said to me, said to my mother after he sold it, he says, you know, I made more money off the prints than I bought it for. And this is another issue, is that originals, that's what they bought. They didn't buy the prints. And Sam English, in this article that I just gave you, he's a noted artist, they sold thousands of his prints, you know, as authentic. So there's many versions of how we manipulate and how we destroy the integrity of Aboriginal people. Thank you.